In this podcast, I'm going to analyze the short story One Summer Night, written by Ambrose B.S. First, I'm going to give a summary of the short story, and then I'm going to talk about on what degree the key characteristics of horror fiction fits in the short story. The story opens with the thoughts of a man named Henry Armstrong who has been buried alive. Meanwhile, above ground, a storm approaches as the three men dig up the grave of Henry Armstrong. Two of the men are medical students, and one of them is a cemetery employee named Jess. The narrator suggests that Jess has done this kind of thing before, and a horse and a wagon waits outside the cemetery fence for the body of Armstrong. The grave has only recently been filled in, so the men finish the job easily. When Jess unscrews the cover of the casket, Henry Armstrong sits up and the two medical students run away terrified, and Jess stays. The students meet the next morning at the medical college and talks about what they saw. They find a familiar horse and a wagon behind a building near the dissecting room. When they enter the room, they find Jess, who demands to be paid, and on the table lies the body of Henry Armstrong with a fresh head wound. So horror is meant to scare, disgust, and frighten the reader. Horror includes the feelings of horror and terror. Terror is the feeling of fear and the expectation followed by the horrifying experience. Horror is the feeling of disgust, which usually appears when something frightening is experienced, seen, or heard. Overall, horror is related to something shocking and frightening, while terror is more related to fear. So the setting of this short story is at a graveyard, which is often used in a horror story to make the setting more dramatic and dark, because a graveyard is not exactly a place we associate with something positive. In the text, we read about these three men who are digging up what they thought was the dead body of Henry Armstrong, but to their surprise, he was still alive. This paragraph is frightening because before you bury a man, you actually proclaim he is dead, which in this case he wasn't. So in this short story, there's no direct sign of archetypical characters such as vampires, zombies, werewolves, and so on. The only archetypical character is a man who was buried alive, who rises up from the dead, kind of like a zombie. Jess is also kind of an archetypical character because he's a murderer, but not a serial killer, but we can assume that he has done this before because he's one of the three men who doesn't run away. The very next day, he's also already in the medical room where he demands to be paid for his work. The work was to dig up Henry Armstrong so the medical students could improve their studying on a dead body. Overall, I do think that studying on a dead person's body is a horrifying thing, even though I know it's for a good purpose, which helps to improve research on the human body. So in this short story, we only meet few characters. We meet the two medical students, Henry Armstrong and Jess. Jess evolves during the story. He goes from being just a guy who digs up dead bodies to become what we assume is a murderer. We assume that Jess is guilty for Henry Armstrong's death because of the fresh wounds on his body that lies on the table. The only character that evolves through the story is Jess. We do not really hear about the medical students, and Henry Armstrong is neither evolving in the story. There are no split personalities in the story, but if we should compare a person from the story with the theme split personalities, we can compare Jess, who is showing his true self when he digs up Henry Armstrong, and when Jess finds out that Henry is alive, he presumably kills Henry only to get paid. And it's kind of scary to think that people would actually murder a human being just to get some money. That is actually horrifying in itself. In the story, it appears that Henry Armstrong is being buried and no one knew that he was actually alive. Comparing to something terrifying, it is definitely that Henry got buried alive. Imagining myself lying in a coffin under the ground with a limited amount of air is a terrifying and a terrible thought. Something I definitely would not want to try. The ending also kind of scary because it is an open ending. When I read the story, it kind of makes me feel uncomfortable because Jess kind of seems mad because he wants to get paid to kill someone. So we do not really know when this story takes place, but according to what is happening to Henry Armstrong, who is buried alive, and the two medical students who gets really scared when Henry rose from his grave, it seems like it is in the Victorian era. The Victorian era was a time where people did not really have any painkillers for surgeries, and they had no electric equipment to reduce the duration of an operation. There was no right equipment like the ones we have today, and it was not unusual if you were really sick or needed surgery just because of a badly broken leg. And if you were not lucky to get a good doctor, you would most likely suffer a lot. So in that time, it was not unusual if a really ill person was buried alive. So what I believe is that a lot of people back then would get a lot more scared of this story than the people from this society we live in now. So what I believe is that this short story One Summer Night is actually a horror story because a lot of the key characteristics of horror fictions fits really good in this short story.